The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. After 30 days of unsuccessfully trying to get the American hostages out of Tehran, the government of the United States is now trying to get the deposed Shah of Iran out of this country. And there is no sign tonight that either problem is likely to be solved soon.
The Iranian hostage crisis was a true test of leadership for President Jimmy Carter, and he contributed his best efforts to ensure the safety of the hostages and of the nation. But it simply was not enough to preserve his reputation as a leader and to maintain a stable relationship with Iran. The United States and Iran were close allies leading up to the hostage crisis of 1979. But any prior relationship would soon be destroyed when students of the Iranian regime seized the United States Embassy, capturing 53 innocent U.S. citizens. It took the whole country by surprise, including the current president at the time, Jimmy Carter. The hostage crisis forced a new frontier in ideology utilized by President Carter throughout his time handling the crisis, as he started off trying to uphold diplomatic values, but proceeded to take matters into his own hands and fight for his people. The crisis has had a lasting effect on Iranian-U.S. relations and their status with one another regarding collaborations and alliances in the future. Especially considering the way in which Carter approached the crisis, leaders after him focused their attention on the restoration of peace and civility of the United States as a whole. The U.S. and Iran started off as allies from World War II, all the way up until after the Cold War. When the USSR demanded they were in need of oil and when they didn't receive their request, Stalin threatened to keep his troops in Iran. America did not take this threat kindly, and American President Truman threatened military invasions. Soon after, the troops withdrew. It isn't proven that the withdrawal was due to Truman's courage, but Iran knew that America was an ally ready to fight for them. The conflict began when the U.S. started to become greedy for wealth. The U.S. organized a coup due to their disagreement in nationalization and put Mohammad Reza Pahlavi into power. Reza began to modernize and westernize Iran. These advancements started off helping the country greatly, but the quick change caused large economic problems, and many Iranians associated these drawbacks with the U.S. Ayatollah Khomeini, a former professor, shared his negative beliefs against the Shah, gaining supporters for his ideas. Reza silenced and arrested those who spoke any opposing ideas to him, causing Khomeini to get exiled from Iran, yet he eventually snuck back in. Protests started, turning violent quickly, and many people participating were killed. The Shah fled from the country because he started to feel like his safety was being threatened, and the U.S. eventually allowed him into the country for medical treatment, against many Iranians' wishes. Militants started a large anti-American campaign. These Iranian militants' mindsets were that the U.S. was the root of the problem, and that something needed to be done about their imposing power on the Iranian government. The U.S.'s involvement of Iranian power through the early coup, the modernization, and the close relationship America had with the largely disliked Shah led up to the largest event thus far in Iranian-American relations. On November 4th, Khomeini inspired young students to attack the embassy due to this rage, and they all listened and followed suit.
November 1979. Fanatical supporters of Iran's new leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and take everyone they find there hostage.
Due to the state of shock Americans were experiencing at the time, people turned to their leader, President Carter, to ponder his actions that would hopefully rescue the 53 hostages. He was in a state of shock himself and was initially unsure of how to proceed when hearing about the news. The split opinions between angry and frightened American citizens only made matters more difficult for President Carter, which led him to take inspiration from past leaders and administrations who had previous experience in overseeing conflict with Iran. For instance, the CIA of the United States helped sections of the Iranian military overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, in August of 1953. While it was an act of solidarity on behalf of the United States, the Iranian people did not like the fact that the Shah relied so much on the U.S. to maintain his power. In March of 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower of the United States and Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi of Iran signed the Cooperation Concerning Civil Uses of Atoms Agreement to ensure that developing countries have access to the same nuclear devices and technology that more privileged countries do. A civil collaboration sparked between the two countries until the start of the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979. Because of these two events specifically, President Carter felt an obligation to uphold the diplomatic, peaceful values demonstrated by leaders past and remain civil. While he begged the Iranians to release the hostages, he did so in a nonviolent manner to ensure that they would not attack again. In November of 1979, President Carter issued Executive Order 12170, which froze Iranian bank assets held in the U.S. This shows that President Carter held off on steering away from past ideals and instead focused on preserving the pro-American relationship that the country had with Iran, as he was clearly still avoiding physical violence. However, this only made Iranians more angry and led them to propose an ultimatum. They would not be releasing the hostages until their trade assets were unfrozen. Because the Iranians made it very clear they would not be releasing the hostages anytime soon, President Carter felt that he had no choice but to make a change. In April of 1980, the U.S. cut off all diplomatic relations and put Iran under embargo, which is an official ban on trade and shipping of goods. However, the embargo was unsuccessful in persuading Iran to release the hostages. Carter then decided to organize a rescue attempt, called Operation Eagle Claw, to save 52 of the hostages that were still held captive. 8 helicopters were initially sent over, but only 5 made it in decent condition. President Carter was advised to abort the mission by military personnel, but in the process of withdrawing the mission, one of the remaining helicopters crashed into another aircraft, which ended up killing 8 servicemen. This event was especially significant because the mission was representative of Carter abandoning his diplomatic values and actively deciding to help his people. However, it was executed poorly and done too late, causing the American people to lose faith in him as a leader and question whether or not the hostages would ever be set free. Ruhollah Khomeini then set new terms in order for Iran to release the hostages. The U.S. had to release all of the Shah's currency assets from the American bank accounts, which were, according to the Iranian government, almost added up to $32 billion. Because of this, Jimmy Carter was faced with a tough situation, which was inconveniently happening just before his next U.S. election against Ronald Reagan. Even after remaining civil for an extended period of time, the hostages were still not yet freed, and violent protests began to erupt on behalf of the American citizens. This heavily contributes to the loss of support President Carter experienced in the heat of the election against Ronald Reagan, especially considering the tactics Reagan used against him. Reagan used the failure of President Carter's methods to improve the crisis to his advantage, in order to make himself look like the more ideal candidate, someone who truly had the country's best interest at heart. Ronald Reagan was completely bashing Jimmy Carter's idea of a sound democracy and began to prioritize safety as a part of his campaign. He believed that no democracy was even possible if the people in society were not safe, which made his former presidency seem very appealing to the struggling public eye. Historians and citizens of this time criticized Jimmy Carter for prioritizing the lives of 53 hostages over the rest of the U.S. population. Not only that, but Jimmy Carter refused to answer any questions about the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, let alone the status of the hostages, which only made him seem more flawed as a leader. Carter had no hope of winning the election of 1980 after the ways in which he handled the crisis. Only 20 minutes after the inauguration of President Ronald Reagan, the hostages were released. The final negotiations between the U.S. and Iran concluded on January 19th of 1981. There were 2 documents that ended the affairs between the two countries, called the Declaration and the Claim Settlement Agreement. The declaration was a compromise between the United States and Iran, saying that the U.S. would unfreeze Iran's assets as long as Iran released the hostages. The Claim Settlement Agreement allowed an unbiased board to help dissolve any trade disputes between the two countries. Ronald Reagan signed an executive order a month later to allow these documents to be put in place. The agreements that the U.S. and Iran made in the declaration overall failed. The countries were unable to come to a civil agreement. For example, in 1988, the U.S. launched Operation Praying Mantis after an Iranian mine almost sank an American frigate. Americans are constantly on high alert when it comes to relations with Iran. To this day, $1.9 billion of Iranian assets remain frozen in the United States. Only $8 million was released back to Iran. As a result of the Iranian hostage crisis, Americans continue to harbor a feeling of distrust towards Iranians. Even though Americans continue to not trust Iran, there could be hope of reunification in the future through the American support of the Iranian population.